This lady is Ketanji Brown Jackson. She's the newest Supreme Court justice nominated by Joe Biden. And there's a lot going on at the Supreme Court this week. And once again, the media is reporting that Justice Jackson steals the show, which it sounds like is kind of the norm with her. Here are the amount of words spoken by the justices in October. You can see that Miss Jackson, the newest justice, is about double all the other ones. And in this particular case, she's arguing that the president shouldn't be able to fire experts because we need experts in the government and they're not working for the president, they're independent. And there's this other Supreme Court Justice, Amy Coney Barrett. This lady here, she's relatively new as well. And recently, Justice Barrett said that Justice Jackson, this lady here, has basically argued that you can't have an imperial president, but you can have an imperial judge. And there's this general argument that Ketanji Brown Jackson, also the first black female to ever be on the Supreme Court, is more concerned with activism than she is with the Constitution. So I wanted to look into this with you and give Miss Jackson a fair shake. And some people who pay attention to this stuff call her the great dissenter. That's because she sits on a Supreme Court where there's a conservative supermajority, 6 conservative justices to 3 liberal ones. So the great dissenter, meaning that she is on the opposition side, the 3, so a lot of the opinions that she writes are dissents to the majority of the 6 conservative ones. So is this the case? Is she a great dissenter? Or is she in fact somebody who's unqualified and was put in there for the wrong reasons? Well, she definitely went to good schools. She received her undergraduate degree and her law degree from Harvard, and she served as an editor of the Harvard Law Review. And when I say she went to good schools rather than she's well educated, which I'm sure she is well educated and intelligent, you just have to point out that Harvard knows that itself has a grade inflation problem, which is more of Harvard's problem, but it undermines this whole idea of Harvard being a signal that you are definitely intelligent when you graduate from there. But in my research, what I found out is that Ms. Jackson has a very interesting background and profile for a Supreme Court justice. One of the first sort of big things she did in law was joining the United States Sentencing Commission. So this is the commission that sets federal sentencing guidelines for federal courts for things like federal crimes. She also served as a public defender, meaning that she was an advocate for defendants, for people being accused of crimes at the federal level, which is a really unique background for a Supreme Court justice, somebody who has represented people being accused of crimes and set their punishments. NPR says that this could be revolutionary to have a former public defender on the Supreme Court. In fact, she's the first judge with a public defender background to be on the Supreme Court, and most judges have a prosecutorial background, meaning that they were the ones who were representing the government in the case. And this is interesting. The Cato Institute, which is basically a libertarian think tank, said that she is the first justice to have authored an amicus brief for them. That's when she basically writes an opinion into the Supreme Court. And this was on the rights of Guantanamo Bay detainees. So Ketanji Brown Jackson is all about due process because she's represented a lot of criminals and seen how the justice system works. So not from the prosecutor side, but from the defendant side. So she talks a lot about coercive plea bargaining, where defendants are threatened with harsher sentences to dissuade them from executing their right to a trial by jury. This is honestly a lot of don't tread on me stuff, which I can get into. She also said that she doesn't think the Supreme Court should intervene in what a lot of the lower courts are doing, because she said that the Supreme Court will intervene, but usually the factual records developed by the lower courts should be respected rather than relitigated by justices in Washington. So what she's saying is that the lower courts did the fact gathering. So why are you going to send the case up to Washington for them to overturn what the lower court did? The lower court should get deference because they know better. Kind of some more don't tread on me stuff. In fact, Ketanji Brown Jackson said that public defenders are the system's check on government overreach, police misconduct, legal misconduct, and all these different parts of the system. Okay, so interesting, Ketanji Brown Jackson. Did not know that. But Ketanji Brown Jackson is also on record saying, I feel that I have a wonderful opportunity to tell the people, in my opinions, how I feel about the issues. That's what I try to do. But when you're a Supreme Court justice, you're not supposed to opine on what you feel about the issues, and that's why Justice Amy Coney Barrett, this lady here, recently said that Ketanji Brown Jackson is at odds with more than 2 centuries worth of precedent, not to mention the Constitution itself. And I learned that when you become a Supreme Court justice, you actually take 2 oaths, one to the Constitution and one to the judiciary. So what I found is that when Ketanji Brown Jackson says things in a Supreme Court hearing like, the president would just be able to fire all the scientists and doctors and the economists and the PhDs and replace them with loyalists and people who don't know anything. That's more of this how I feel about the issue stuff. Because there's no legal argument in any of this. Nothing about the Constitution. This stuff is just kind of shooting from the hip in the courtroom. In fact, Justice Jackson is setting records for being an extremely active questioner, meaning talking in the courtroom, when there are 9 justices. Again, here it is. You can see the words the justices spoke, and Ketanji Brown Jackson is basically double even the second most questioning justice. But that's not to say that she doesn't have some interesting ideas. So for example, she is advocating for a concept known as progressive originalism. So originalism, which a lot of these conservative justices, these 6 on the conservative supermajority, champion, is this interpretation of the law that follows the intent of the framers of the U.S. Constitution. So basically, they'll argue this is what they meant. So what Justice Jackson, is talking about with progressive originalism is this idea that, for example, the 14th Amendment, which is the Equal Protection Clause saying that everybody should be treated equally, was intended by the framers to be race conscious instead of race neutral. And that's because this was written in the post-Civil War reconstruction. So credit where credit is due. This is an interesting and sound legal perspective. If you're going to say that you are paying attention to the original intent of the law, and then you're quoting a law that was written just after the Civil War, race definitely matters. And even if, like me personally, I might not like that, I want to live in a colorblind society, if indeed people who wrote laws were considering race when they wrote them and you're being an originalist, if you want to be honest about it, you have to take that into consideration. And in my research, what I found about Ketanji Brown Jackson is that there are a lot of viral narratives about her. So there was one where there was a little quote that came out that she said in the courtroom that basically said that free speech was getting in the way of something that the government was doing. Well, it turns out that quote was taken out of context, and actually, Justices Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett agreed with her. So clearly, this was just a viral narrative thing that was taken out of context to kind of slander her. But she did also find herself in a weird spot when she basically argued that the reason that there should be race-based redistricting is because certain minorities are disabled. She basically said that the American for Disabilities Act shows what happens when you have a minority who's at a disadvantage. And she kind of gets into this argument where the Constitution treats the status of being black in America as a category warranting specific protection and remedy, much like the status of having a disability warrants specific protection under the ADA. I would call that an awkward argument. So is Ketanji Brown Jackson a great dissenter? Honestly, I don't think it's fair to call her that yet. More like somebody who really wants to make herself heard. So being real about it, it seems like she's excited to be on the Supreme Court. She's talking, honestly, way too much. But she has a really interesting background for somebody being on the Supreme Court, even if she has this concept of progressivism in her identity. She actively rejects what was called living constitutionalism, which was this idea of basically fabricating what's in the Constitution from some of the earlier liberal justices. So I like that. Plus, she's got some don't tread on me stuff going on, but she's found herself with some awkward arguments going on. And she probably needs to remember a little more that above all, her oath is to the Constitution.